I think we'll start getting underway. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're calling from. Thank you so much for joining us. I do see Matthias on the line, and I'll just ask Matthias, would you like to say a few words on behalf of the Global Alliance before we dive in?
Yes, so thank you all for being here, and thank you, Kim and Colleen, for being our presenters for this webinar. We are very keen to know about this survey, this research that CPRS has conducted, and thank you for engaging in Global Alliance Ethics Month. That's the third year we are hosting this month, and thank you all for being present live here, and also keep following Global Alliance website, because many content like videos, webinars, and articles focused on ethics are being shown during this month.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, and it's a great lineup, and we're so excited to be part of the Global Alliance, part of Ethics Month, part of this global conversation on ethical PR, which I think just continues to grow in importance. And Colleen and I are really happy to share some of the research that we've done in Canada. We think it's pretty unique in terms of not only conducting a survey with PR professionals across the country, but Canadians themselves and how they view our profession. So we're going to go back and forth a little bit in our presentation today, and we're really going to leave plenty of time for questions towards the end. I'd like to start today with an acknowledgement. Colleen and I are both from Calgary, Alberta. So really like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani Nations, the Tsuut'ina and Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes here in Treaty 7, territory of Southern Alberta. I also really want to acknowledge that the work that we're sharing today is just such a compilation of efforts and work. We're going to talk about the full journey that we've been on, but it's really part of this larger community of work. Leger, one of Canada's leading market research firms, has been conducting our membership survey every year, but they also conducted this PR perception survey. Colleen and I are both past presidents of the Canadian Public Relations Society, who has advocated for the ethical practice of public relations, code of professional conduct, standards, and promotion of advocacy for PR for more than 70 years. So being part of that community that's really focused on this, and through our membership in CPRS, being part of the Global Alliance community. Introduce Colleen, who's with CK Communication Strategies, and I currently work for Argyle, one of Canada's fastest growing PR firms. We're specializing in engagement, public relations, and reputation management. So really just want to kind of acknowledge that we're representing such a large body of work and thousands of members across the country. So let's talk trust. I had this question: is it even possible anymore? And here in Canada, we're watching in real time these trucker convoys playing out in protest of COVID mandates, and continuing to ask ourselves these questions. As PR professionals, we've always been more than a little obsessed with trust. How to get it, how to keep it. What happens when you lose it in a crisis, or as we see lately, a continual erosion of trust in organizations, in governments, in media. So is trust even possible? I think it's a valid question today. Should we be asking for trust or working to earn the confidence that leads to trust? And I think that's an important distinction, and we'll talk about that today. Certainly in my past life as a communications leader for a provincial regulator, trust was just not something we could attain. We really had to go after that confidence that people felt we could keep them safe. So we're going to go through, a little bit of that and look at that environment. But I think it's important, to acknowledge where we are today. And sorry, I'm toggling between two computers here. In terms of what COVID is doing to trust in public health officials. Many of us here in Canada saw, public health officials put on a pedestal in the first early days of COVID. Everything they said was just taken, with absolute trust. We looked to these leaders. And then gradually, as people got frustrated, as the information, we got more information about COVID, people really started turning on some of these officials, turning on their governments. And so we're seeing, the misinformation out there. We do a lot of work at Argyle with vaccine promotion and vaccine campaigns. And at the root of that is the mistrust. At the root of that is addressing that misinformation. But this lack of trust, this erosion of trust, has started, I think, to hit a crisis point way before COVID hit any of our countries. We're going to talk a bit about our journey and the work that CPRS is doing, and really started diving into this in a meaningful way in 2014. But in January 2017, that was a pivotal moment for many of us. That was really where we had to pivot from promoting good PR to really calling out bad PR, to really calling out unethical PR when we saw it. And I think looking at what our associations were doing in our various countries about really standing up for ethical PR and helping our professionals and our members understand how they could show up as ethical PR professionals. All of a sudden, we were dealing with terms like alternative facts. When Sean Spicer stood up in front of the world and blatantly, spoke mistruths, I think associations across the globe had to act. For CPRS, we issued an immediate statement calling out the activities, saying that we didn't deal in alternative facts, saying that we did have a code of professional standards, and that we did have to act honestly and authentically with members of the media. Edelman called for a global ethics standards. The Global Alliance jumped into this conversation right away. I think we recognized worldwide that this was a crisis point for our industry, and we really had to do something in terms of speaking out and demonstrating what ethical PR was. So I mentioned that this was a journey we were going through for quite some time. And so just really gonna quickly go through this. But in 2014, we were actually looking at revamping our strategy as a CPRS and understanding how could we be better advocates for PR, how could we better engage our 14 local societies across Canada. And one of the biggest risks we noted was the impact of bad or unethical PR on us all as a profession. And I don't know about you guys, but every single time something happens and somebody gets caught lying or somebody has a PR fail, my mother immediately asked me, isn't that what you do? And so I have to go back and explain, no, that's not what I do. So from there, we really looked at this risk matrix, how we could do better in terms of collecting information and really pulling together what the future of PR looked like. So we commissioned the future of public relations, the elevation of PR white paper. Colleen's going to speak a bit to that. We used that to have an unprecedented national conversation with members across the country. We went out twice to engage, both on the trends that we saw in PR, and then on this strategy and where the CPRS should lean. And we heard overwhelmingly that being that champion for ethics really, really was something that we had to lean into much more heavily. And so that led to the National Task Force on Ethical PR, which was created in 2019. I was the chair of that, and Colleen and some of the people on today's call were members of that. And admittedly, we borrowed from our colleagues across the globe. A lot of the things that we put into place that Colleen will speak about, we took from the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. We also saw, new tools. In some ways, the lack of ability to gather was frustrating through COVID, but we were absolutely able to join in these virtual conversations and really have deeper conversations on ethics and on ethical pieces. And then in 2021, I think we really saw this rebirth of ethics and social justice and equity issues in PR. The DEI conversation and some of the conversations being seen across the globe have really led to, I think, a richer and more nuanced conversation on ethics. So I'm going to turn it over to Colleen, who's going to talk a little bit about that white paper and what stemmed from that.
Great. Thank you, Kim. And am I driving? Oh, you got it. Okay, great. So yes, as Kim said, really one of the first steps that we took was the commissioning of the white paper, which ended up being named the Elevation of Public Relations. We did engage Dan Tisch to engage a number of senior thought leaders from CPRS to really dive into what was the future of public relations in Canada. So they found that the megatrends in PR, there were really 7 that they defined in the white paper. The first being the rising business value of reputation, relationships, and communication. They found that effective CEOs have come to understand that the value of reputation and the role of PR and communications management in building relationships that drive it. CEOs have also come to see that communications as one of the most critical aspects of the modern executive skill set. The next megatrend that they defined was the empowered audience. Access to global publishing power via social web has empowered each of us as citizens and consumers, creating new risks to organizational reputation and new challenges for organizational communications. The next megatrend was content shock. The explosion of content available to all of us has created what writer Mark Schaefer calls content shock, when exponentially increasing volumes of content intersects our limited human capacity to consume it. We know that many speak and few listen. While giving voice to publics is widely accepted to be fundamental to successful public relations, as well as democracy and social equity, most organizations use communication technology to improve amplification and not improve listening. Then we have disintermediation, fake news, and the decline of journalism. Disintermediation and the endless torrent of free content have decimated the revenue ranks of modern journalism. The 6th megatrend that they defined was a gap in wealth and trust. Globalization and automation have made the world wealthier, but the concentration of wealth has created a gap between well-educated, affluent knowledge workers and the mass public. The previously mentioned megatrends also exacerbate the long-term decline in public trust in both private and public sector organizations. And finally, we have AI comes to PR. The rapid advance of artificial intelligence presents a near-term future in which software will increasingly be used to create content. So they also took a look at what this really meant for CPRS and our future and what we need to do to remain relevant. They defined that we need to do a better job marketing the profession and demonstrating how ethical PR can fight fake news, how to better support professional growth at all stages of a member's career, how to set and promote our standards of practice, and how to create community of practice across Canada. So we wanted to really start our national conversation based around the findings and the trends outlined in the white paper. We knew that our journey would only work and be as strong as the engagement and endorsement of our members. We started our national conference in Kelowna, British Columbia in 2017 with a full workshop of more than 200 delegates where we discussed the white paper, tested agreement with megatrends, and asked questions about what the CPRS should and could do to help Canada's PR professionals prepare for the future. We engaged the 110 members of the College of Fellows, held discussions with the presidents of the 14 local societies across Canada, held webinars and in conference calls to talk about the white paper and gather information. And then we held an online survey to gather insights and thoughts from members from across the country. The one thing that was clear is the white paper really resonated with members, and they were passionate about the future of the profession and how the CPRS could play a stronger role in supporting them in their careers. There was also a growing call for the CPRS to be an advocate and champion for ethical PR. Following this first round of engagement, we produced and released a What We Heard document, along with a draft strategic framework and engagement strategy to the board in the fall. We then used this framework and What We Heard document to continue our engagement, including rolling out the targeted webinars with senior leaders and influencers, including the College of Fellows, presiding officers, and President's Council. We facilitated a focused discussion with the group of senior leaders around the proposed vision, mission, and overall direction for the strategic framework. We encouraged our senior leaders to help champion the engagement activities by leading similar sessions at their local level and encouraging members and non-members to provide feedback through the online survey and amplify the call for action to complete the survey through their local social networks. We then released the What We Heard document and proposed strategic framework through targeted emails to all members and students, encouraging them to provide feedback through the online survey and amplifying the call to action through their networks. We targeted non-members in the PR and communications management industry through an article and link to the survey in the CPRS communique, which goes out to approximately 5,300 subscribers. We also sent a targeted email with What We Heard document, an invitation to complete the online survey to people who held Director of Communication roles or above in the top 50 Canadian companies. We leveraged our online LinkedIn group and pushed the What We Heard document and survey out to key industry influencers from PRSA, IPRA, and the Global Alliance. With a new vision and mission, we built out 4 key themes for our strategic framework. And those themes really focused around community, collaboration, conscious, and careers. In an era of fake news and alternative facts, CPRS must do more than talk about ethical public relations. We must be the champion for the public relations industry in Canada. While having a code of professional standards and a commitment to ethical PR is important, we must speak out in support of public relations, call out unethical PR practice, and demonstrate leadership through a clear disciplinary policy that is fully implemented. We must understand the public perceptions of our industry and develop plans to promote ethical public relations across Canada. So with the forming of the National Task Force on Ethical PR to really start to look at how we could implement the conscious part of our themes, we developed a interview series called PR Matters that you can find on the CPRS website. It was an interview series that explored current trends and how ethical PR shows up in day-to-day work of some of our senior leaders. We launched a decision tree, again, building off of the work that CIPR did with a series of questions that help members really think through their put some critical thinking around their ethical decision-making. We launched a PR register that really helps organizations understand if they're engaging practitioners who have committed to adhering to a code of professional standards and ethics. We launched a fake news primer to help people understand how to fight against misinformation and disinformation. We issued a number of issues briefs, and we participated with CIPR in the launch of the AI and PR ethics guide. But one of the key pieces that we did undertake was the PR perceptions survey. This unique survey really took a look at what other surveys haven't done and really focused in on both the perceptions of PR professionals as well as the general public as a whole. We wanted to establish a benchmark for public perception of PR in Canada. And we wanted to understand where Canadians and PR professionals agree and where they differ, and how public relations is perceived by the general public. We also wanted to test the value of the work that CPRS carries out in advocating for accreditation, professional development, and overseeing ethical standards. We really too wanted to have a benchmark and the ability to measure the results of our advocacy communications efforts going forward. The survey went out to, was completed by 1,501 Canadians and 209 PR communicators. It was completed between February 3rd and May 1st, 2020, using Leger's online panel. The margin of error for the study was plus or minus 2.5%, 19 times out of 20 for Canadians, and plus or minus 6.8%, 19 times out of 20 for PR communicators. Not surprisingly, there were areas of significant alignment between Canadians and public relations and communications professionals, especially when it comes to the role of PR in organizations, the importance of ethics and accreditation, and the role of the professional association. However, when it comes to perceptions, public relations and communications professionals report stronger levels of trust in their colleagues than Canadians and see themselves more as credible and trustworthy than the general population does. So now Kim will get into some of the findings.
Yeah, so as Colleen said, there were some real interesting areas and strong agreement. And I think some of the things we saw was, this agreement on the importance of the various aspects of the work that PR relations and communications professionals do. And Colleen will dive into, we use the term communications and public relations professionals because there was some back and forth and debate over how people saw this. So you'll see the communicators reflected in white, and you'll see Canadians reflected in red throughout. But certainly Canadians believe in the importance of the PR professional's role, from addressing fake news and false information to dealing with the speed and the volume of information flow, and really understanding that, as PR professionals, we use our understanding of people and the issues to inform decision makers within our organizations. And there's an expectation with Canadians that we will do that. So you can see, the numbers are slightly different. Not surprisingly, you'll see the communicators numbers being quite high. They understand their own role, but really good alignment, 83, 87, 85%, really strong scores amongst Canadians as well. I think too, in agreement that we were all feeling really overwhelmed. This survey was done just in the first months of the pandemic, and people were reporting that we were really feeling overwhelmed with the amount of information online. Going back, and this was a really important question for us, not just because it was in the Elevation of Public Relations white paper, but this was around the time that James McNamara's book, Organizational Listening, was coming out, and there was a lot of conversation into what was listening. And so certainly, communicators and Canadians both agreed that most organizations were putting more effort into promoting themselves or amplifying their message than actually listening to what their audiences and their stakeholders were saying. And this is so key and so important when you look at it as a measure of building a relationship that leads to trust. What I did find interesting was, communicators really felt that social media was giving the opportunity for public's voices to be heard. But I think we were seeing a bit of a decline in that amongst Canadians. And I think this is perhaps a reflection of just the sheer volume, where once you felt you had an opportunity to express yourself, now you're lost, I guess, in the sea of voices in social media. What was really interesting was an understanding of the role the association has to play in trust and ethics. And so not everybody understood that there was a professional association, not everybody understood what we did, but when we explained it to Canadians, a real alignment there, 97% of communicators and 83% of Canadians agreed that there was a role for the CPRS to play as an advocate for ethical PR. That, again, 93% and 85% agreeing that the CPRS must enhance that code of professional standards, that we have to provide provide ethical counsel to our members on ethical PR. And a lot of that was, work that we were doing with issues briefs, with the decision tree, with really doing more than just, having a PD session, which is important, but really giving tools and resources. And equal agreement at 82% that the CPRS needed to enforce ethical violations, that we needed to take action when we saw unethical PR. Colleen, you're muted. Sorry.
Big faux pas. We do have our differences, but there's strong alignment in our current study on questions around the importance of having a code of ethics. There is a divergence of opinion when it comes to trust, credibility, and other aspects of living the code of ethics. Nearly all communicators believe that those in their profession act ethically. However, the general public ranks communications and public relations professionals as sixth most ethical source of information behind their friends and family, subject matter experts, employees of organizations, journalists, and advocates. So if there's agreement on the role public relations and communications professionals play and alignment on ethics and professional development, why do we see this gap in credibility and trust? We believe there are a number of factors at play. First being the lack of awareness. It's not surprising that CPRS members support greater advocacy for ethical PR and actions to call out bad actors in our profession. The other factor is really the term PR itself. There's a growing concern around the negative inference of the term PR or public relations. In fact, a review conducted by the leaders of the Dublin Conversations demonstrates a declining trend in the use of the term public relations. In 2019-2020, the State of the Profession survey by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations also found that two biggest challenges for the profession are identified as how others view the profession, which supports the above review, and how the value which is placed upon the work of practitioners, and the value of which is placed upon the work of practitioners, which is also supported by the findings of this survey. Ultimately, this divergence in opinion points to both a need and an opportunity to champion the role of ethics and how it is integrated in our daily work. Even though people may not be aware of our code of ethics and professional standards, they do agree and support them. So another finding, which was really music to my heart, is Canadians value APR accreditation. There's strong alignment, 80% agreement from both communications and public relations professionals and the general public that CPRS should provide training, professional support, and mandatory accreditation. Both Canadians and communicators see the value of APR accreditation. Communications and public relations professionals take a more individualistic view of the APR and believe those who hold the designation provide value to their organizations, make positive contributions to their society, act in an ethical manner, and are generally trustworthy. While communications and public relations professionals see the value of the APR, only 46% of members in 2019 reported joining CPRS for accreditation. 4 in 10 members are accredited, and 1/4 reported being actively interested in pursuing the APR. The general public is more likely to trust organizations that hire professionals with an APR. And in fact, 67% of Canadians believe organizations should only hire communications and public relations professionals who have an APR, compared to 33% of communicators and public relations professionals. And I think this speaks to the work of James Grunig and Todd Hunt, where they stated that many practitioners tend to hold a careerist view and values to the profession rather than professional values. Then we found accountability is key. There was a lot of support for the establishment of a publicly available directory of members who adhere to a code of professional conduct and conduct and ethics. So again, the good support for launching the registry. Oh, Kim, you're on mute.
Both of us are doing it. So I just move into a little bit of, how this impacts us. We know how this impacts those markers of trust. Look at how that translates into our relationships, our organizations' relationships with the audiences and the stakeholders that they serve. This is something that Argyle has been doing since 2016, is really understanding what is at the root of those relationships that really does lead to that greater confidence, that greater trust. From how Canadians feel about consumer loyalty programs and insurance companies, to understanding the relationship with local and Canadian governments, to recently learning more about how COVID has changed our relationships with our employers and each other. Argyle's Public Relations Index just dives into those elements of confidence, trust, and connections to brands and organizations. And we see the same elements. These are not, I think this is where we excel as PR professionals in terms of understanding what really does lead to those strong relationships, those relationships that engender trust. Jack Welch says trust is like art. He knows it when he sees it. And ultimately, to trust is to be vulnerable. We trust our families, we trust our friends and our partners. We expect that organizations are going to fulfill their commitment to us as either audiences, citizens, or consumers. And when those commitments are broken, our confidence is shaken and that trust erodes. We don't like to be vulnerable, and we like it even less when that vulnerability is taken advantage of. Think of your own reaction the last time somebody looked you right in the eye and said, "Trust me." It just doesn't get there. So what does a PR professional do in this environment when that is your role, to build those relationships? Well, lucky for us, I think it's still about relationships, and that's ultimately what we're good at. To me, the pursuit of trust is like the pursuit of happiness. It can't be demanded. It can't be ordered. It's the outcome of doing things in a certain way. Listening more than you speak, being authentic and human in your communications, focusing on the relationship rather than the transaction, and keeping your commitments to those around you or those that you serve. And as we've seen in our research, it starts with that dedication to ethics, adhering to a code of professional conduct or standards, belonging to an association that provides guidance, professional development, and advocacy for PR, for ethical PR. That having that designation that demonstrates to people that you are committed. If you do these things, you'll build that strong relationship, earn confidence, and then maybe see trust as an outcome. I do want to add a couple things before we end. Ethics goes beyond our organizations, and often we're faced with those personal ethical dilemmas in our work. And one of the things I've learned is to follow the advice of James Grunig and spend time learning and researching about ethics now. The time to explore where your ethics lie or the ethical considerations you'll apply to new or existing clients or work situations isn't as you're making those decisions. I think it's important to decide where your ethical line is well before you're being pushed across it. I've seen this situation throughout my career. I've experienced this personally, and it's only through this international community of public relations professionals creating spaces like this for this kind of conversation. And I congratulate you for taking time out of your day to be part of that conversation. This is the community that sustained me when I was faced with ethical dilemmas at work, and knowing that I was backed by a professional association and a code of conduct and a designation that really helped me understand those lines. So I'd like to leave you with this, which is probably one of my favorite quote about ethics, but that's: character is not only looking, it's doing the right thing when everyone's looking. It's when you want to pay. And I think that is the reality that we live in PR, where everybody is always looking and examining and judging the work that we do. So with that, I think we are happy to open it up to some questions. And maybe I will stop sharing, and perhaps what we can ask is if people perhaps put your hand up, and we'll do our best to, or you can type something in the chat as well. Elizabeth Hurst. You're on mute.
First, Betsy, it's so nice to see you.
Great to see you again. Yeah, this is great. I just have a actually fairly nitpicky question. There's so much to chew on in what you've presented, and it is so essential right now. I teach course in ethics at McGill, and I'm now developing a new one as an online course. And I'm also in the SQPRP, which is the Quebec chapter of CPRS, or if you're a Quebecer, it's a separate society, you know, it's a political thing. Anyway, our Quebec chapter of the Canadian Public Relations Society is now looking at a possible revision of its ethical code. So all this stuff is really top of mind for me, and you guys have nailed it, as you and Dan did with the elevation of public relations. I have a very simple nitpicky question, and that has to do with the Canadians who were surveyed in the perception survey. I know they were part of the Léger online community. Has Léger been able at any point in your dealings to let you know what kind of people they are? I mean, they're a self-selected group, but do we know anything more about them? And do we know anything about their previous knowledge of public relations before they participate in the survey?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elizabeth. I think, you know, the panel is quite representative. I know Léger works really hard to recruit to have it representative. So I know for us from a demographic, socioeconomic, gender, age, and you know, location, we really wanted to make sure we had representation across the country. I think we were able to achieve that. We did, I mean, two things we didn't do that we wish we had done was, one, asked to get that baseline of their understanding of the PR profession and whether or not they had those, you know, preconceived notions. So we didn't ask, you know, what they knew about PR as a profession beforehand. And we wish we had split out the terms communications and PR professionals. It would have been interesting to see if there was a difference in opinion using the word communicator versus PR professional. So I think we have some, you know, some pieces I think we'd like to add on to the next survey. This is a benchmark and we do want to go out again. But I think there are some really good pieces. But I think we're fairly confident, even with a self-selected group, that panel did give us a good representation.
Thanks.
I did notice in the chat, Daryl is asking where we can get a copy of the white paper. It is on the CPRS website, and we can follow up.
And I did post a link to it in the chat as well.
Great. And Heather Mansell, having a challenge in your organization, being at the table in the room where discussions and strategic decisions are being made. I think we've all been there. Building those relationships that engender trust in your advice as a professional. It's so difficult, I think, you know, in terms of what comes first, right? You know, getting to the table or getting the strategic advice that gets you to that table. I think, Heather, you know, one of the things personally I've done is often provided some of that background and that information, and sharing those trends or sharing the difference between you know, ethical, non-ethical PR. One thing I've always done, you know, before I joined Argyle, I spent 27 years in-house. I have always included the CPRS Code of Professional Standards at the end of every communication strategy that I provided for my organization. It's like not every plan, but when you're doing the big 1 year or 2 year strategy, I've always had that as an appendix and always indicated that. I've always cited the Melbourne mandate. I've always cited the latest in the Barcelona principles, or using this national community and the research and the work that they're doing. I think sometimes, you know, we understand it, but showing that research and the body of work that goes into that, I think, you know, using some of these pieces, understanding what leads to trust, you know, another plug for the Argyle work, all those studies, those results are up there. So for example, you know, you can go in and find out, gee, what makes people trust their local governments? Well, that gives you an opportunity to say, hey, there's research out there that says people don't trust their local governments if they don't feel they have a seat at the table or their voice isn't heard. So being able to do some of that research, the Institute for Public Relations, another great body of research, I think that just helps give you some of that internal credibility.
And we have a question from Eloy. And I hope
Yes,
I
hi.
pronounced that right.
Yeah, that's fine. It's Eloi, but I go by Eloy also.
Apologies.
No problem. So you mentioned, of course, the great abundance of information as a major issue in society today, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and of course, communicators, professional communicators have a big part to play in this phenomenon as originators of much of this information. So I was wondering if you saw this great abundance of information as containing ethical issues for the profession, and if so, what would be, in your view, if you have one to share, of the responsibility of professional public relations practitioners, and in terms of what they should or maybe should not do in relation to that issue?
Colleen, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. Sorry, I was also monitoring. I really think it's reinforcing understanding disinformation and misinformation and the difference between the two. And really, the IPR has got a great resource on misinformation and disinformation and how to combat that. CPRS also has our misinformation and disinformation primer. So really knowing and helping people understand how to sort through all of that information and who the sources are and what's credible, what's not, where you're able to corroborate, the same information from multiple credible sources, and not amplifying that misinformation, correcting it, where you can. And so I really think it's important for people to have that good understanding and arm themselves with the tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think Frank had a great question, in terms of is ethical PR even a thing? Ethics should be intrinsic attribute of PR, without which it's not PR, it's something else. So as PR, are we already, are we diluting PR to accept that there can exist unethical PR? And Frank, I think I was right there with you in probably 2015, 2016, until we were faced with blatant manipulation of facts, and blatant, unethical PR practices that had to be called out. And so I do think that led to a conversation around ethical PR, and ethical PR, being about building that relationship. I've always felt my role as a PR professional was to advocate for the audience as much as for the organization I was working for, that you play that role. And so it's unfortunate, but I do think that term, an ethical PR, tends to, at least resonate with people, and especially with members who were feeling frustrated, frustrated with being painted by that same brush, and where, the work that Andy Green and Parag McKeon have done, with the Dublin conversations, and diving into some of those, PR fail, bad PR, those terms are rising. And so if we're seeing those terms rise and we're seeing those terms used, then I think we do have to counter that with something. And I think ethical PR, in my opinion, is something that helps us differentiate that for people faced with that disinformation.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts you'd like to share?
Daryl, increase in virtual sessions, more people working from home, lack of FaceTime. How has that impacted the ability to build trust in-house and external? It's interesting. I think, Argyle has a very deep public engagement practice. So we, do a lot of public consultation and public engagement, and I've seen both. And I think the question is, it depends on your audience. I don't think there's any, like it's always been with our work, There's no one cookie cutter approach that works. One of the things we find is certainly, equity deserving communities, vulnerable populations are really left out of the conversation by switching to a virtual environment. However, one of the benefits of the virtual environment is we've seen busy parents. We've seen people that would not come to an in-person open house jump onto virtual sessions and have their say in a way that they wouldn't before. So I think the future for us is that hybrid. The future for us is finding out the ways in which communicating and listening is going to work for the audiences that we're trying to reach, and developing those programs for them. And I think that the same is in-house. Working with in-house teams, yeah, we've definitely seen an erosion of that connection in some cases with the lack of face-to-face. So I think the answer really is that virtual, that hybrid. What is that going to look like? And it's probably going to look different in every organization and with most audiences. Colleen, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. And I think it's one of those things too that people are craving and want to hang on to that flexibility. So organizations really are going to need to find that right balance for them and then walk the talk. If they say they're providing flexibility, they need to support their leaders to actually help their leaders understand how to lead in a hybrid environment and not just pay lip service to it being available, but employees not feeling that they can trust that they can actually work flexibly. If they're not seen in their seat. I think the days of leaders thinking that you're not producing or being productive if you're not being seen, those need to go by the wayside.
Elizabeth.
Question. One thing that really stood out for me on your slides was in public perception, when most people, both PR people and other Canadians, were more likely to trust an organization that hired only APRs, 70% of PR professionals and 60% of other Canadians. But then in the next column, which I saw you'd circled on the slide, was that people said when organizations should hire only APRs, public relations people were only 33% in favor, while most Canadians were 67% in favor. And I wondered if you read into it a reluctance of some public relations professionals to put themselves in a position of being judged by their peers for fear that they might fail, or maybe not wanting to put the time into getting an APR. Is that what conclusions did you draw from that?
I think two things, Elizabeth, and one thing that we chuckled over is 33% is like roughly the amount of CPRS members that hold an APR. So we all think it's a great idea. So that was one thing that struck me. But I think it points to back to what Colleen said, is the APR has been seen as a career investment. It's something you get, but not necessarily a designation that is taken as seriously as a PN or a CPA. But what we're seeing is the public does perceive it that seriously. And the public does trust that designation as an indicator that somebody has had the requisite training, the requisite experience to obtain that designation, and that it comes with a responsibility to adhere to a code of professional conduct. So I think that that divide demonstrates that it's seen as perhaps a nice to have, a PD thing amongst our professionals, but what we're seeing is the public sees it as something much more serious and something that they can have trust in. And I think that's something really important for us as we go forward to promote the APR to our memberships.
And I think that's exciting pieces. We've never really had that reinforcement of what the true value of the APR is. So if we can help members understand that the general public really sees that as valuable, accreditation or designation, and that your credibility and helping raise the credibility of the profession as well by being accredited.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you for continuing to take time to have these conversations. Thank you to the Global Alliance for putting on a great lineup for Ethics Month. Encourage you to look at the calendar and attend the other sessions. And yeah, I think that's all for us. Have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you.
Everyone.